Okay, great. I'll be up.
Okay, we can get everyone to go on mute. That'd be great so we don't pick up on your other conversations. So first, just for an overview of what we're going to cover today, and I just want to emphasize, first of all, that this is a super high-level overview of our water infrastructure, equitable infrastructure toolkit. We're going to talk about some other more in-depth training opportunities that will be available. But because there's a lot today, this is sort of a step through to help people understand what's there and what's possible and some, what it kind of looks like, unpacking it a little bit. So we're going to start with just some introduction, context and background, and then give you some sort of very high level overview of what's in each of the sections that you'll find when you go onto the website across the bars: so utilities, infrastructure, affordability, and decision-making influence. Then we are going to give a couple examples sort of like pathways for application, how we see that it might work if you were thinking about digging into the toolkit and using it, some ways that you might be able to think about how to do that. We will save some time for discussion, and we really want to hear from you about how this resource can be useful to your work. What kind of training, more in-depth training, is going to be useful to people, because we're starting to plan that, but it's definitely not all set in stone. And want to get input into that to make that most valuable. And then end with one training opportunity we do have coming up right now. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, River Network, we are a national organization, and we connect and empower local and state organizations working on water issues all across the country. And the map shows how many people out there doing just that across the country. And so we sort of work and envision this future where everyone has access to clean and affordable water across the country. And we just finished our annual River Rally in virtual. Next year we'll be in Washington, D.C. in June. I hope you can join us there. And we work across a number of key issues, including drinking water, resilient communities, healthy rivers and agricultural landscapes, and policy and laws, in addition to leadership development across the network. So to learn more about it, you can go to our network. And our Equitable Infrastructure Toolkit is a great example of how we provide tools, and then the training and supporting people to connect to each other to actually use these resources to achieve healthier communities and waterways. So before we get started, I really want to introduce and give a shout out to the team that made this Equitable Infrastructure Toolkit possible. I think several of them are actually joining us on the call today. But we had a fabulous consulting team supporting this work, and that include staff from IB Environmental, the Center for Neighborhood Technology, RUD Resources, communications firm, and then our team here at River Network. So a shout out to them, and they will also be joining us for some pieces of the training coming up, and are really a great resource on this topic. Would also like to acknowledge our funders for this work, the Spring Point Partners and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, for their support of our work that made all of this. So a little bit as we're getting started about our why. Sort of, how did we come to this Equitable Infrastructure Toolkit? And I think we've sort of been a couple of things that came together for us at River Network. Is first, we really heard from our network over the last, I'd say, 5+ years, that groups really wanted to be engaged with how does funding happen at the local level? Like, why is my town investing in detention pond as opposed to green infrastructure? Or how are rates set? Like, how can we make water more affordable? What can I do at the state level to influence how state funding from the federal level gets distributed more equitably? There are all these sorts of questions, and it's always like a little bit overwhelming to try to understand how this federal infrastructure investment comes down to the states, or what are the options at the local level? How does it get spent? So we heard that loud and clear across a couple of our different issues areas, like, hey, can we be at the table? Can we be at the table for these decisions? And it was really it makes a lot of sense, because as most of you know, the great majority of infrastructure decisions and funding happen often at the local level, even if the money comes from the federal level. And so having local organizations, community advocates at the table is really important to try to influence in how that investment happens, what shape it takes, and how it can be used more both equitably and sustainably for our waterways and our communities. And so the toolkit's really designed with that in mind, trying to figure out, okay, if I'm someone, you know, I live in a community and I want to work on the local level, where can I plug in? How can I work with my local utility? What do I need to understand about rates? Or, you know, work with a group, but I'm thinking about state advocacy and providing a lot of different avenues from which individuals and organizations to come in and try to learn the basics and engage either a beginner's level or sort of an intermediate or advanced level. And so we really hope that the toolkit can provide that experience in a lot of different ways. And great timing too, I think, because, you know, in the hopes, knock on wood, that there's additional federal dollars coming down for water infrastructure. It's a great time for advocates to really know how to influence their state revolving loan fund, for example, at both the state and the local level. So we will be really looking for ways to help groups use and leverage that funding as that comes available. So specifically, you can see our goals here. We hope the toolkit will help people identify factors that affect affordability and some approaches to addressing them, become familiar with water infrastructure funding and financing mechanisms. Things like, we've put a lot of emphasis on the state revolving loan funds, but others also understanding how bonds work, for example, how other federal funding streams are out there that can help pay for water infrastructure and what flexibilities exist in them. And finally, probably most importantly, how to understand and influence water infrastructure investments at the local, state, and federal level. You've probably seen the toolkit. That's the web link for it there at the bottom if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. When our internal project team at River Network, when we started working on this project, we sort of, you know, had this term that we've been talking about, equitable water infrastructure investment. And so, but we decided that we really did need to have a working definition together that we could use as a team to sort of be our North Star to make sure we were heading in the right direction with our consultant team of like what this is about. So just sharing this with you, because obviously it's not like the world's definition, but it's the one we use to guide this, and be interested in your reactions to this definition and if that's the same way you think about equitable water infrastructure investment. But we really thought of it as when infrastructure dollars for both clean water, drinking water, and stormwater are directed by the community. So there's a real sort of local ownership element that's important, we think, to directing these infrastructure dollars to public health, clean and safe, affordable, and accessible water. Secondly, that really it's distributed in a way that supports low income and communities of color, where often there's been a historic lack of investment or they're still lagging behind in investment over time. And so that was really important to think about how there could be a priority for communities to increase the equitable aspects of the results of this investment. And finally, is to think about the sustainability, you know, of our waterways, which are critical to making sure we have this access, and also the water utilities, the water systems we work with, who also need to be funded and have the support to help us provide clean and safe water. And so that's an important part of this whole ecosystem of water infrastructure funding. So that's what hopefully has guided this, and you should see that sort of those things throughout the toolkit as you look at it. So I'm gonna stop there. We're gonna launch a poll to find out sort of where folks are as of right now in terms of your level of knowledge of water affordability and water infrastructure funding.
Looks like we have about 50% of folks have had a chance to weigh in. We'll give everyone just a few more seconds to share where you're at with water affordability and water infrastructure. And we'll go ahead and close the poll now, and we'll take a look at the results.
All right. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, April. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like about half of folks say consider themselves intermediate, and then after that, a beginner, and then some of you, a smaller amount of you, consider that you are advanced in this, and so that's great. So we got all types, and I think the toolkit can be useful for everyone at all different levels, and so we'll definitely be looking for your feedback as you start using it from those different perspectives. All right. All right, hand it over to you, Shada.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shada Esnasheri, and I'm the Drinking Water Program Manager here at River Network. I'm going to go ahead and walk us through kind of how the toolkit is organized. And I do just want to reflect on the poll for a moment and say, I think all of us internally came into this project with varying levels of understanding and experience working on water infrastructure. And this was a super big learning process for us all, and including how to organize this information and think about how the different sections relate to each other. So we hope that it is useful for beginners and advanced folks alike. So if we want to go into the next slide. So I'm just going to walk you all through each individual section and kind of what it covers, the framing for it. And I do just want to highlight, if you had a chance to go look at the link with the toolkit, each of these sections are available as standalones, but I do believe that all of them interact with, kind of talk to each other. So I think that was part of our process, and I think the consulting team can speak to this, of how do you separate out these different components and what really goes into equitable water infrastructure. So the first section we have here is the utilities section, which is obviously a very important piece of water infrastructure and implementing equitable water infrastructure. So some of the grounding questions in this section are around how water utilities are managed or regulated. And then specifically, we were interested in how utilities decision-making impacts affordability, and infrastructure dollars impact affordability. So covers things like that utilities cover, such as rate setting, governance and management and oversight, a little bit about understanding a water bill and what goes into a rate, and then different components that can impact things like water affordability, whether it's things like improved asset management or actually providing a customer assistance program, and then how infrastructure dollars impact the availability of those programs or can support those programs. And then this section is finished with some recommended actions for utilities, including improving asset management, pursuing state and federal funding, and then as well as actions for the individuals, which we'll get more into for the last section, but we can go to the next slide. The second section that we have in the toolkit is infrastructure, that broad term. And this was really meant to be a section that goes over all of the funding and financing mechanisms from the federal down to the state and local level, and then some opportunities for influence. What is water infrastructure? How is it paid for? And then how considerations for equity. So there's a lot, as KB just mentioned, on the state revolving loan funds, but there's also some exploration of other local dollars or other federal programs, and getting familiar not only with the federal funding programs, but the authorizing or appropriating bills as well, such as the Water Resources Development Act. And then some conversation about how to do more to impact equity with state revolving loan fund dollars, such as focusing on low income and frontline communities, which is a big focus of this toolkit. And then, like I said, utilizing other funding and financing options at the state and local level to boost the impact of SRFs and other federal funding dollars. Next slide. And then we, of course, have a section dedicated to water affordability. So again, you can already see how these sections are talking to each other. We can't talk about water affordability without talking about funding and talking about the role the water utility plays in water affordability. And when we talk about water affordability, I do want to say that the focus here is on customer affordability, although affordability for a utility itself certainly plays into customer affordability. And acknowledge that there are many definitions out there of what affordable water means. So we explore kind of some metrics that are used in the conversation happening around defining and measuring water affordability for a household or a community. And then different things that impact water affordability as they relate to water infrastructure. So thinking about population loss in a community and built infrastructure that no longer matches the population of the community, how climate change and land use impacts affordability, and then walking through opportunities to influence affordability at the federal, state, and local level. Go to the next slide. And then finally, the last section, again, this shows up in all of the sections, but we really wanted to have a dedicated section toward taking action. So when we talk about influence, we're talking about the power to affect change at the local, state, or federal level. It matters in addressing the issue of aging water infrastructure, affecting water affordability, and ensuring, as we said, with our definition of equitable water infrastructure, that funds are community directed and implementation is community directed with implications for equity or equitable distribution. We also really wanted to think about and talk about, if you look at this grounding question here, how you can build intersectionality between water infrastructure and other issues like health, housing, and economic vitality. So thinking about water and water infrastructure as a much broader issue that touches different components of individuals' lives and has different impacts, and as such needs to be funded and thought about in an equitable manner. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to just walk through a couple of examples that we came up with from the local to the state to the federal level, drawing on things that are in the toolkit of how you could utilize it to influence or impact policy or decision making. So thinking about, so if you want to ensure local water is affordable, which ultimately that's where those decisions are made, you can explore the affordability section, learn more about impacts and causes of unaffordable water, what local water affordability programs and policies exist either in your community or examples from other communities across the country. And then some opportunities to take action include exploring the utilities section, thinking about utility practices and programs, infrastructure section, thinking about how federal funds can be used to be directed towards water affordability as part of a water infrastructure investment or otherwise. And then reviewing the decision-making and influence section and thinking about how to actually engage with and work with your utility. I think something that we've talked about quite a bit is getting folks up to speed on the vocabulary used by water utilities and being able to engage kind of on a level playing field in that manner. I think the toolkit does a really nice job of that. Next slide, please. So the state level example we have here is if you want to ensure your state is prioritizing funds based on equity, we encourage you to explore the infrastructure section again, learning about how the state revolving fund works and its flexibilities, thinking about a lot of federal programs, there are set-asides for disadvantaged communities. Where does that fall within your community? What are other ways that you can think about equitable implementation? I think barriers to entry or applying for these federal dollars comes up a lot. So thinking about that and how we can get more communities in need going after these dollars. Some other take action opportunities are reviewing the affordability section, establishing priorities for those most in need, the infrastructure section, advocating for how state funds are spent, and then the decision-making and influence section, reviewing the state intended use plan, which I will not try to explain during this presentation, but more reason to sign up for our training later if that is all jargon to you. Next slide, please. And then finally, an example from the federal level, if you want to ensure federal infrastructure programs are fully funded, to learn more about the infrastructure section. So again, why does water infrastructure matter? Thinking about intersectionality again, we have water infrastructure delivers water from one point to another, but how does that impact public health? How is that a housing issue? That sort of thing. Reviewing federal funding for water infrastructure. What are the different funding streams and how can they be influenced? And then for taking action, we have review the decision-making and influence section. We've got a whole get involved section. One suggestion is getting familiar with what I talked about previously, the Water Resources Development Act, which I believe is authorized every 2 years. And I know a lot of groups and coalitions that we are a part of work in coalition to advocate for increased funding for water infrastructure, whether it's through WRDA or directly thinking about the clean water or the drinking water, SRFs. But I think power in numbers here is one way we're thinking about this. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to April to take us through some questions.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So, hey, KB, would you mind sharing the slides back really quick just for a second? So what we want to do now is open it up for discussion. We just gave a really quick overview of what's in the toolkit and what some of the practical applications might be in terms of how you might use the toolkit. And what we're wanting to do now is just open it up for discussion and learn more about what questions you have and what you're interested in learning more about when it comes to understanding and influencing federal funding for water infrastructure, understanding and influencing the state implementation of water infrastructure funding, and also understanding and influencing water affordability through infrastructure investment. So we're going to use a tool here in a second to sort of crowdsource some of the questions and topics that you're interested in learning more about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a link in the chat. I'm going to ask if you all could click on that link, and that will open up a web page in your browser. And what we'd love to have you do when you go to that link is we have the first question that'll be up is around the federal funding for water infrastructure. And what we'll do is take a look and see what questions and areas of interest you have. And then we'll see what we might be able to address while we're here on the call today in terms of letting you know what's in the toolkit and point you towards some of the areas of the toolkit that you might be interested in looking at to get some additional information about your questions or the topics you're interested in. So KB, if you will stop your screen share again now, please. I will, I'm going to share my screen and I will be able to see what everybody is putting in Mentimeter about what you're interested in learning more about. So give me just a second to open that up and we can take a look what folks are sharing.
Outsourcing information that Troy answers.
All right. KB and Shada, are you able to see the results coming in from Mentimeter? Great. All right. So as folks are entering their ideas in, KB and Shada, or anybody else who is on the call too, if you have thoughts on where we might point folks to, let's just jump in and start addressing. And I also want to also encourage you that if you want to come off mute and just verbally share what your topics you're interested in or what questions you're interested in exploring, we welcome you to do that as well. So let's see, the first one that was entered has to do with solar powered desalination facilities, and if those are ever discussed as an option for water infrastructure in the toolkit.
You know, one, we have a part in the infrastructure section that talks about all sorts of infrastructure, and we sort of make the point that we talk about infrastructure broadly. There's sort of traditional infrastructure, and then there's distributed infrastructure, which is more like rain gardens and green roofs or even wetlands and so forth. We did not, I have to say, get into other infrastructure, like the type of energy that would actually power infrastructure per se. So that's an interesting add-on. Yeah, so whoever put that on, thank you. That's a interesting thing to consider in the future.
I also just want to take a second to acknowledge that we've got several folks who helped us put this toolkit together on here, so you all know who you are. If you want to jump in at any point, please feel free to come off of mute and respond to any of these questions. Something else I'm seeing coming up is some kind of time-sensitive questions, like what is the key timing? What are the key opportunities in 2021 for us to advocate for more
really cool.
funding?
I've done this before.
And then what federal funds are expected to be approved or allocated this year. So one approach that we did take to this toolkit is trying to kind of denote the time and place in which this toolkit was developed, and address some of the legislation that was coming up, but recognizing that we also wanted this to be an evergreen resource. So as far as answering your questions about what's happening right now in Congress, it might not do that exactly, but we'll give you an idea of what to look out for in order to track down the information that you need presently.
Yeah, and I think that a complement to this infrastructure toolkit is our monthly policy exchange calls, which can also provide information on, and that's sort of the place to stay the most up to date on when and where the infrastructure money, like if there's points of leverage and influence and good times to make calls. And so we can provide that information to you as well. So yeah. I think another theme I see is sort of like, you know, how do we use money to prioritize it to disadvantaged communities and influence.
SRF set-asides for green infrastructure, that needs to come from the federal level.
Yeah. So I think that's on the infrastructure funding, we cover the federal pots, including the set-asides, which as mentioned, are set-asides for green infrastructure and water efficiency that can be used. And also there's great section that our team put together on existing federal funding, both the state revolving loan fund as well as some USDA programs, WIFIA, like if there are flexibilities or priorities within them for disadvantaged communities that are really helpful to know about when you go talk to your state or your local government.
What about the question about funding for Indian reservations and for tribes? Is that addressed in the toolkit?
Yes, yes, there are some sections that specifically address funds for tribes.
Great. So it looks like there's also some interest in how do we fund sanitary sewer overflow problems, funding for source water protection for drinking water. Wondering, is USDA funding covered? What about that? Are the different funding sources for water throughout the federal government, are those talked about in the toolkit?
Yeah, and if anyone from IB wants to jump in here, yeah, our team did a good job of providing an overview of some of the different places within the federal government where funding for water infrastructure does come from, and gives you information about how to find out more about it. Source water protection is actually better covered in our drinking water guide. There's a whole section about funding source water protection there, and so we're happy to share the link to that.
Yep. And then I think this is a question that a lot of folks have is around like, how does the funding come? Is it as a loan that you have to pay back, or is it does it come as a grant that it's, you know, maybe you don't have to pay it back? And how are projects being prioritized? And is it based on the new administration's priorities or something else?
So KB and April and Jada, I'm here. I'm happy to jump in on one or two of those if you want.
Sure.
So which one? Which should I? Just that last question? Well, I have a thought on the first question to give kudos to the person who was able to type in first about the solar projects for I think Tigisal, right? Mm-hmm. If I think of, so USDA has funding for water systems, drinking water systems, where desal will fit in, the state revolving fund programs, which, like KB said, we spent a lot of real estate, a lot of the bulk of the infrastructure chapter sort of is dedicated to the SRF. This is called a general rule of thumb, but the federal government sends money to the states and gives the states some rough guidelines, especially in the case of the SRF. With USDA, it might be a little bit more specific, right? And then the state can decide what its priorities are. So that is a major opportunity for you all to say, we think desal is a really important topic for our state. And so we want you to, at the state level, prioritize that somehow. Give extra points in an application, for instance, for desal projects. Now, if it's a landlocked state, maybe desal projects is not relevant, right? Because there's no ocean coast right there to nearby to actually desalinate. So the question of solar powered, I would say it should fit as a what's called green project in the SRF programs for most states. They do, EPA at least encourages states to do solar on their water and wastewater systems. Desal might be a little bit more specific, and you'd have to look at the individual state there. So I hope that helps. But that's just a general way. Know that the federal government sends some rules, and then your state is, they often have the opportunity to sort of refine the rules a little bit. All right, so that's that one. Any other particular one y'all want me to jump in on? I saw one about funding for private wells. Sorry, April, that one was short, so I could, we do have a section on that. So one of the issues in the country, I would say in this country in general, is that while septic tanks are responsible for a lot of the pollution and contamination of our, water bodies, and while some people have their own wells at their house, the regulation for those two is not very strong, right? So, and then therefore there's not a lot of funding sources from the federal government for that. But we do have a section in the toolkit where we try to address, okay, so, the federal government or even the state probably doesn't have a lot of programs to directly help individuals with their septic tanks or their private wells, but here are the few sources that we know about. And, there are ways that the SRF, for instance, could help through a link deposit. And so that's mentioned in the SRF section. 319, for instance, may help with replacing septic tanks and getting people on public sewer in individual states. So we do mention those a little bit. Sorry, April, go ahead.
Great. And there was also the really good question about, or interest in knowing more about, like, how this funding shows up, like as a loan, as a grant. Do we cover the different sources of funding beyond just what EPA has? Do we talk about funding, for instance, from USDA? Is that covered, and where might folks find more information on that in the toolkit?
Okay, well, unfortunately, low interest loans are always more popular and common and easier to get than a grant. There are limited grant opportunities, but we do cover things like USDA's Rural Development Program, where the only relevant applicants would be serving 10,000 or less in population. But we do make mention of the 319 project as well, which would be grants. And I'm sure your folks are, the folks on this Zoom meeting are very familiar with that, but it's a grant, but there's a match, okay? So yeah, so we touch on some of those other things, yes.
Great, and one final topic of interest here before we move on to our next question is, there's a few topics in here that folks have mentioned around funding for innovative sewage treatment options where standard options are not working the way that we need them to, or having funding that can be used for things like green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. Is that something that folks can learn about and get more information on through the toolkit?
I would say very little directly on the on-site options for wastewater. That kind of fits in my mind to the sort of local individual septic tank issue and how to fund that. But the other piece, could you repeat the other part of the question there, April?
If there is information in the toolkit where folks can learn more about set-asides for green infrastructure and other kinds of innovative new technologies and approaches.
Yeah, and I can let KB or Shada, they'll do a better job than me on this, but that was something that that was a big objective. So yeah, KB, do you want to add anything else on that? We did, as KB mentioned on one of her first slides, that was one of the ways that we defined for this project what equitable meant, that a community had the option of saying we prefer a green approach versus the traditional gray approach. But KB, do you want to add anything else on that?
Oh, I think that's just right. Yeah, it does talk about like the different types of infrastructure and some of the places where there are set asides, and then also where they're not set asides, how you can still get funding if you include it in a certain way.
Thank you so much to KB and Shada and Stacy for providing some of that insights into the kinds of questions and topics that are covered in the toolkit. And one of the things that we're going to share with you before we sign off for today is an opportunity to be part of a more intensive training. And so if you're interested in getting some of these questions answered and getting some more guidance and support and some financial support also to dig deeper into some of these questions, we'll talk about an opportunity that we have for that. So, but what I want to do now is move to our next question. And so if you go back to that link again, in your browser, it'll now have the opportunity for you to share in Mentimeter what questions you have and what topics you're interested in learning more about when it comes to understanding and influencing the state level implementation of this water infrastructure funding. So we invite you to just give that some thought for a second and type into Mentimeter what some of those topics and questions you might be interested in when it comes to influencing how your state goes about implementing and allocating water infrastructure funding. Great, we're starting to see some really good topics and questions come in. So I encourage you to keep adding those, and we'll just give folks just another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll start addressing some of these topics and let you know what you might be able to find in the toolkit to help get some answers and some more information about some of these great questions that you have. Great. So KB, Shada, or others that are on the call today, one of the questions that is coming up is, do we talk about bond ratings and how a state's bond rating and local bond rating, for that matter, how those bond ratings impact the state's ability to secure funding?
Yeah, I can start on that, and Stacy jump in. For bonds, we wanted to make sure we covered sort of how bonds work in general. And so there is a piece about how they work generally, what a rating is, and how that affects your bond. We also talk about some of the, like, what are considered more innovative bond types, like what are being called environmental impact bonds, and provide some examples of those. So people could be at the table. And Stacy, I'm not remember if we talked about the state bond rating, state piece of that or not.
Yeah, I agree. We didn't really get into the state's bond rating very directly. So that's a pretty complicated question. So in some states, like I am based in Georgia, so I know that state pretty well. But the state's bond rating in Georgia is very related to it helps the local governments, because there's this interesting arrangement where the local governments that borrow, say through the SRF program, for instance, are sort of able to sort of take advantage of the state of Georgia's bond rating. That may not be the same for each state. One of the sections that this question kind of reminds me of, and then the other piece where it says, and also local bond rating, we talked about how the SRFs we could do more with the SRFs, and some state revolving fund programs will actually sort of get access to more capital by leveraging bonds with their SRF dollars, and some states don't exercise that option. So when it comes to bonds, besides what KB said, where we talked about like environmental impact bonds that are emerging, and we have a couple of good cases of, they worked pretty well in the DC area, for instance. We also talk about state bonds a little bit in terms of the SRF, but we didn't really talk about state bonds too directly. So, and it very much depends on the state though, right?
Great, thank you. There's also some interest here about wanting to understand how a state goes about deciding what its priorities are in terms of what it decides to direct funding toward. And if there are examples out there of states that have done innovative things that would, sort of stand out as really great examples that we might want to encourage our own states to look at. And if the toolkit can help us see some of those good examples that we might then be able to use, and how where in the process do we plug in to influence our state's priorities when it comes to how they direct this infrastructure funding.
Well, I'll let anybody else chime in here, maybe KB or Shada, and then I can see if I have a couple cents to add.
Thanks, Stacy.
Yeah, so I think, yes, the answer is absolutely. For those two questions, I think there's a pretty big emphasis within the toolkit of understanding the state revolving fund and how it does work at the state level, and figuring out at what points, like when the state makes different, Shada referred to it earlier, there's an intended use plan, there's a project priorities list, and then there are also sort of the guidelines that the state adopts overall. They're influenced by some of the federal requirements. But understanding, we provide a lot of examples of the sort of flexibilities of what you can do with the set-asides, for example, or how you can prioritize or use money for green. And then some also case studies of different states that have taken different approaches, in addition to resources and some link to some examples of those. So I think, and I think this is absolutely going to be a topic for further training. I'm glad it came up here. It sort of reflects that I think that will be a good thing to dig into further.
Yeah, I would just underscore what KB said. So if we look specifically at the state revolving fund in each state, there needs to be this document called the intended use plan. And so you can access a lot of information there in terms of when meetings are happening, et cetera. But there's also a requirement for some sort of public meeting or public hearing. And so that's something that you can try to find on the website, find the date and the time and location for that, and put it on your calendars and show up at that meeting. From my experience, they are notoriously unattended. Folks don't really show up very much to those. So if you do, now an exception, let me give a caveat here. I know in one state I attended the IUP, the in public hearing meeting right after when ARA came out around 2009. and there was standing room only. In that same meeting room, literally nobody would show up normally. So I should say that this coming public hearing process, we might have more people showing up, but generally that's a missed opportunity where folks in the community, different stakeholders, do not show up at those meetings to get their opinions heard. So if you think that your state should be looking at desal, you show up at that meeting and you say, hey, what about giving some priority points for that? Or how are we somehow prioritizing those types of projects? You're interested in disadvantaged communities, which is something that's built into the SRF program, you show up at those events. Of course, you could write letters, et cetera, to get people's attention, but that's a great opportunity. And a lot of the toolkit, especially that D&I section, decision making and influence, is dedicated to the steps in how recommended steps. One of the things we talk about is maybe, don't just show up to the public hearing and accuse people of things. It might be better if you can email somebody who's relevant first, talk to them on the phone, and sort of develop a positive relationship there. But definitely, if they don't respond to you, you do have the option of showing up at the public hearing. So, yeah.
All right. So what I want to do now is advance to our final area of discussion. And we'd love to hear what you're interested in learning about when it comes to understanding and influencing water affordability through infrastructure investment. So this might be a question that you have or a topic that you're interested in learning more about when it comes to how we can push the needle forward on water affordability through infrastructure investment. So we'll give you just a 30 seconds to a minute to think about that, add your ideas, and share with us what questions you have and what topics you're interested in learning more about. While we're waiting on folks, KB or Shada, anything that you would want to say or add that might give folks some ideas about what they might find when it comes to, like, what questions often you see come up that we heard from folks as we were developing were thinking about developing the toolkit that we were sure to want to address in the toolkit?
I think broadly speaking, what I often hear is just like navigating. I think the approach we're taking with this toolkit is like lots of folks have sort of surface level or some level of understanding of what the state revolving loan fund is. They know about WIFIA, that bonding plays a role, but I think it's following that money through and opportunities to influence that, and like, what is the state or local process? How does that interact with utilities of different sizes in urban settings versus rural settings? I think understanding, I guess, how the money flows and what are the opportunities for influence is one of the biggest things I hear frequently.
Great. So thanks to those of you who are adding some questions and topics to the list here of things that you're interested in learning more about. So yeah, as one of you say, there's so much here, absolutely. But one area would be, how do we influence our independent water board or other decision-making bodies who are making these decisions around affordability and pushing the needle forward on how we can get some new models and some different models in place for equitable water rates and better policies when it comes to disconnection and reconnection of where water's been shut off. So how do we address that kind of those kinds of questions in the toolkit? and what might folks expect to find?
Yeah, so I think this is covered in a few different sections in the toolkit, but just identifying what sort of board or governance structure your water utility has, and then what sorts of meetings are available and how to approach those. Like I said previously, like I think one thing that the toolkit does a nice job of is bringing folks up to speed on what is the language, what are the public meetings or opportunities, like what's the best way to engage with members of your utility to start a conversation around water affordability. How do I figure out what the rate structure is at your affordability in the first place? If there is a customer assistance program, if there are if there is an asset management program in place, to think about how infrastructure is influencing water affordability and rate structuring. If there's a water loss issue that's impacting water affordability. So I think this is touched on not only in the affordability section, but also the utility section, and then of course the decision making and influence section. And one thing I wanted to flag about that last section too is that we tried to, or I should say our consulting team really tried to lay out like what are the opportunities for someone who's just coming into this work, and then someone who has a bit more experience navigating this. So denoting a beginner, intermediate, or advanced approach. And I see some questions in here about organizing coalitions around this or getting community involved. And we do speak to that. And we even talk about some coalitions that we're a part of that we know are working on these issues.
Yep. Thank you, Shada. And I think kind of related to that, what could folks expect to find when it comes to just sort of pulling the curtain back to understanding how utilities set their rate structures and how how a water bill even, how a utility figures out like what goes in a water bill and how much you end up getting charged on your water bill every month? Is that process sort of uncovered in the toolkit?
Yeah, so we do a little bit in the, I can't remember now if it's the utility section or the affordability section. As I said, these are all talking to each other, but talking about like really breaking down the language of a water utility bill and what goes toward what each charge is, including fees, right? So one thing we talk about the actual rate for water use, but then what are the additional fees that we see showing up on water bills. And there's, like I said, a little bit of discussion of different models for utility boards or governance, and then how, depending, if it's a public utility or privately owned utility, who ultimately if there's an elected position versus a board, who ultimately has influence on adjusting or influencing, increasing rates, that sort of thing. So I saw something else in here about case studies, and I just wanted to flag that throughout we've got different case studies for each section. So yes, related to water affordability, but other issues as well.
Yep. Great. Thank you so much. And so just being aware of the time and that we have 5 minutes left, we want to spend the last little bit of time that we have with you all today telling you about an opportunity that we have to sort of take a deeper dive into these different areas in the toolkit. So the nice thing about you all sharing this feedback that you just did on these 3 slides is that we'll capture it, and so we'll have this is very helpful to us in terms of figuring out subsequent training that we'll do for sort of unpacking this toolkit. We sort of see the toolkit almost like a textbook on how water infrastructure works and how water infrastructure funding and affordability works. But we also want to offer some classroom time to be able to sort of be able to work together as a group and collaborate to think about it. So we have this training opportunity coming up that I'll let KB tell you all about, and we'll put the link in the chat as well so you all can take a look at that a little bit further if you're interested.
Yeah, wonderful. And my thanks as well. This is super helpful to get some reflections on which pieces we would want to go in deeper on. So The opportunity we've referenced is initially is this one that we're having what we're calling a boot camp in a good way. It will be a deeper dive into the toolkit over 6 sessions every other week, sort of in the August to October timeframe. And we'll probably, you know, depending on who joins us for that, tailor the topics a little bit, but they will mirror the different sections of the toolkit and dive deeper. And we'll have Stacy and Anna joining us for 1 session each, and then providing you both some homework and some office hours in between some of these sessions. We will be providing a $1,500 stipend for active participation for organizations. You can send more than 1 person if you'd like to. And the idea is that you learn enough that you can kind of come up with your plan of action for what's going to be important for your community or whatever you're working on by the end of it based on this information. So the form, April put it in the chat, we're looking for applicants by July 26th. It's a pretty short application. And we'll be hosting, I think, up to 7 groups to be part of this cohort. So that's our first sort of in-depth training we'll be providing. We will also, though, based on the feedback we got today and through this boot camp experience, be providing other one-offs that might be like a deep dive, say, on the state revolving loans, on like how do you work at the state level. But we are hearing that there's some really critical issues out there that people are interested in and are very timely given the investment that's likely to come in through Congress in the coming months. So that's our sort of our idea for that. And so please consider applying and share it with others if you know others who might be interested as well. Shada, anything you want to add on that? Okay. So yes, shout out, give us a shout out if you have any questions about that. Our contact information is here. And you know, we appreciate your time today.